Paris, the morning of September 30th, 1811. In a quiet house near the Champs-Élysées, a 59-year-old novelist named Fanny Burney finished breakfast, wrote a few letters, and waited. She had known this day was coming for weeks. A note had arrived from her surgeon, Dominique Jean Larry, chief medical officer to Napoleon's Imperial Guard, informing her that he would arrive at 10 o'clock, properly accompanied, to remove the tumor from her right breast. There was no other option left. The pain had spread down her arm until she could no longer lift it, and every physician who examined her had reached the same grim conclusion. At 10 o'clock, 4 carriages stopped outside her door. 7 men in black entered her bedroom. There was no anesthetic to offer her, because none existed yet, anywhere in the world. A folded cambric handkerchief was placed over her eyes, but not before she caught the glint of steel through the fabric. She was given a small glass of wine cordial, told to lie back on a mattress dragged onto a bed frame, and asked in French, a question that still unsettles historians 2 centuries later, who would hold her breast steady for the knife. There was no one else. She held it herself. What followed lasted 20 minutes. Burney later wrote to her sister that when the blade went in, cutting through veins, arteries, nerves, and flesh, she began a scream that did not stop until the incision was finished. She fainted at least twice during the operation and could never fully reconstruct the middle of it. Only fragments, sensations, the scrape of metal against bone. 7 surgeons. 20 minutes. 1 fully conscious woman holding her own body open for the men trying to save her life. This was not cruelty. This was simply what surgery was for every human being who had ever needed it since the beginning of recorded history. That was 1811. But the story of a world without anesthesia stretches back thousands of years before that morning in Paris, and the ending, the moment everything changed, was still 35 years away. For most of human history, cutting into a living body was treated as a last resort, attempted only when the alternative was certain death. Ancient Sumerian texts from around 4000 BC already described the analgesic properties of the opium poppy. And by the Middle Ages, physicians across the Islamic world and Europe had developed something called the soporific sponge, a cloth soaked in a mixture of opium, mandrake, and henbane, held beneath a patient's nose in the hope of dulling the senses before the knife came out. In 1676, the English physician Thomas Sydenham simplified centuries of complicated recipes down to 2 ingredients, opium and alcohol, a formula that would remain, in one form or another, the best medicine had to offer for the next 170 years. If 20 minutes of conscious surgery already has your stomach in knots, subscribe, because it only gets harder to watch from here. None of it worked reliably. Alcohol dulled judgment more than pain. Opium and its tinctures, sold under names like laudanum, could ease anxiety but did almost nothing against the specific, focused agony of a blade parting living tissue. And too much of it could kill a patient just as surely as the operation itself. So surgeons relied on the only 2 tools that actually helped: speed and other human beings. A typical operating theater before 1846 required 3 or 4 strong assistants, sometimes called dressers, whose entire job was to physically pin a fully conscious patient to a table while the surgeon worked. Patients bit down on leather straps or rolled cloth to keep from biting through their own tongues. Screaming was so universal that hospitals built their surgical wards as far as possible from the general patient rooms, so the sound would not terrify everyone else waiting for their turn. Historians estimate that at the start of the 19th century, up to 80% of surgical patients who survived the operation itself went on to die from infection or shock in the days that followed. Surgery, in other words, was not a treatment you sought. It was a horror you endured because the disease was worse. Fanny Burney's own surgeon understood this arithmetic of speed better than almost anyone alive. Dominique Jean Larry had spent years perfecting rapid amputation on the battlefields of Napoleon's campaigns, and at the Battle of Borodino in 1812, working without rest through a single day and night. He reportedly performed roughly 200 amputations, sometimes finishing a leg in under a minute. Soldiers screamed, bled, and were carried away to make room for the next stretcher. And Larry's reputation for saving lives through sheer velocity followed him back into civilian practice, into the same bedroom where Bernie would later hand him her own body to operate on. Speed was not a personality quirk. It was the only anesthetic medicine had. There was, however, one thing a patient could look for that at least shortened the ordeal even further. And by the 1830s, in Scotland and then in London, that thing had a name: Robert Liston. By the late 1830s, Liston had built a reputation as the fastest surgeon in Britain, a man medical historians would later nickname the fastest knife in the West End. Trained in Edinburgh and working at University College Hospital in London, Liston understood something brutally simple about his era. Since nothing could dull a patient's pain, the only mercy a surgeon could offer was to finish before the body fully registered what was happening. He turned his operating theater into something close to a public performance. Students packed the surgical gallery, stopwatches in hand, and Liston would stride to the table, roll up his sleeves, and call out to the room, "Time me, gentlemen." A typical above-the-knee amputation took him roughly 2.5 minutes from first incision to final stitch. His fastest recorded amputation, according to the medical historian Richard Gordon, was 28 seconds. Liston's obsession with speed was not showmanship for its own sake. It saved lives. Where the average surgeon of the era lost roughly 1 patient in 4 to shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection, Liston's own figures showed he lost closer to 1 in 10, a genuinely remarkable survival rate for the period. His technique was so fast that other surgeons studied his hand movements the way athletes study film today. He also had a habit of taking on patients other doctors had already declared hopeless, and pulling a striking number of them through. In his textbook, he argued, somewhat contrary to his public image, that the truest mark of surgical skill was knowing when not to operate at all. Since the wider medicine's understanding of disease became, the fewer amputations would ever be necessary. Liston was not simply a showman with a fast blade. He invented the locking bulldog forceps still used to clamp arteries during operations today, designed a long splint for stabilizing broken thigh bones that remained in hospital use well into the 20th century, and was one of the first surgeons to insist on clean hands and instruments before an operation, decades before germ theory gave anyone a scientific reason to bother. His fellow surgeons found him arrogant and combative, and he was briefly dismissed from one hospital post over accusations that he was poaching patients from rival doctors. But even his critics admitted that when a case was declared hopeless everywhere else, Liston was the surgeon people asked for by name. Popular history remembers Liston mostly for one particular story, and it is worth being honest about it here. According to a widely repeated account, first popularized by Richard Gordon in the 20th century, Liston once amputated a leg so quickly that he also sliced off 2 of his assistant's fingers and cut through the coattails of a watching surgeon, who reportedly believed he had been stabbed and collapsed from the shock. In this version of events, the patient and the assistant both later died of infection, and a terrified bystander died of fright, giving the operation, as the story goes, history's only 300% mortality rate. It is a fantastic story. It is also almost certainly a legend. If Liston's story has you gripped, drop a like on this one. It genuinely helps a small channel like this keep going. No primary source from Liston's own lifetime confirms that this operation ever happened, and most medical historians today treat it as an apocryphal exaggeration that grew in the retelling. The kind of story that survives not because it is documented, but because it captures, better than any real case file could, just how dangerous speed as anesthesia truly was. What is documented, without dispute, is that surgeons everywhere were desperately searching for something better than a fast hand and a leather strap. And by the early 1840s, the first real candidates for that something better had already appeared, and had already, humiliatingly, failed in public. In December 1844, a Hartford, Connecticut dentist named Horace Wells attended a traveling exhibition of nitrous oxide, the so-called laughing gas, and noticed something the crowd found merely funny. A man who gashed his leg badly while under its influence seemed to feel nothing at all. Wells had a colleague pull one of his own troublesome teeth the very next day while he inhaled the gas himself. It worked. He felt almost nothing. Certain he had found the answer to centuries of surgical agony, Wells arranged to demonstrate nitrous oxide publicly at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, in front of a lecture hall of skeptical medical students in January 1845. It went wrong. The gas bag was pulled away too early, or the dose was too weak, and as the surgeon began pulling the patient's tooth, the man let out an audible groan. The students in the gallery jeered. Someone reportedly shouted the word humbug, and Wells left the amphitheater that day a broken man. His idea publicly ridiculed by the same medical establishment he had hoped to convince. He returned to Hartford in disgrace, and the story of nitrous oxide anesthesia might have ended there entirely had a former business associate of his not still been quietly experimenting with a different gas altogether. That man was William Thomas Green Morton, a Boston dentist who had watched Wells's public failure closely and drawn a different conclusion from it. Nitrous oxide was too weak and too unpredictable. But a stronger compound, sulfuric ether, might not be. Through the late summer of 1846, Morton tested doses of ether on himself, on his dog, and finally on his own dental patients, refining a glass inhaler that could deliver a controlled vapor rather than a crude soaked rag. Convinced he finally had something reliable, Morton approached the most respected surgeon in Boston, Dr. John Collins Warren, chief surgeon and co-founder of Massachusetts General Hospital, and asked for the chance to prove it in front of an audience that would not forgive a second embarrassment. The demonstration was set for October 16, 1846, in the hospital's domed surgical amphitheater, a room that would later be nicknamed, forever, the Ether Dome. The patient was a young Bostonian named Gilbert Abbott, who had a vascular tumor beneath his jaw that needed to be removed. Word had spread of Wells's disaster the year before, and the room filled with the same kind of skeptical, arms-folded audience that had jeered a colleague of Morton's out of the building. Morton arrived several minutes late, delayed by last-minute adjustments to his inhaler, and Warren, visibly irritated, was on the verge of beginning the operation without him. Somewhere in that gallery sat students who had watched Horace Wells get laughed out of the very same building less than 2 years earlier, and more than a few of them had come expecting to watch history repeat itself. He was not late by much. Morton administered the ether through his glass apparatus, and within minutes Abbott's body went slack, his breathing slowed, and he stopped responding to his name. Warren picked up his scalpel and made a 3-inch incision beneath the young man's jaw. Nothing happened. No scream, no flinch, no 4 dressers holding down a thrashing body. Abbott lay still, breathing evenly, while the most feared moment in 19th century medicine unfolded around him in complete, almost unbearable silence. This is the moment that Fanny Burney's ordeal, 35 years earlier, had been quietly waiting for the entire time. The moment that would have spared her the 20 minutes of conscious agony, the fainting, the scream she said she could still hear ringing in her own ears years later. It came too late for her, and too late for the untold millions of patients across recorded history who had endured what she endured. But it had finally come. When the operation ended, Warren turned to the stunned gallery of students and colleagues and said the sentence that would be quoted in medical textbooks for the next century: "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The room, according to multiple accounts, sat in genuine disbelieving silence before it erupted. News of what had happened in that amphitheater spread through Boston within days, and through the medical world within weeks. A surgeon in London would later remark that the news reached him faster than almost anything he had heard in his career, carried across the Atlantic by ship in a matter of weeks rather than the months such news usually took. Robert Liston, the fastest knife in the West End, the man whose entire surgical philosophy was built around the assumption that pain could never be eliminated, only outrun, heard about ether within 2 months of that first demonstration. On December 21, 1846, at University College Hospital, Liston performed the first operation under ether anesthesia in Europe, amputating the leg of a butler named Frederick Churchill. Before he began, Liston reportedly turned to his audience of students and delivered a line that has survived almost as long as the operation itself. "We are going to try a Yankee Dodge, gentlemen, for making men insensible." Churchill later said he woke up confused, asking the surgeons when the operation was actually going to start, unaware that his leg had already been removed, while he lay peacefully unconscious. The man who had spent a decade perfecting the art of finishing an amputation before a patient's nervous system could fully register the horror of it had just watched that entire skill become, almost overnight, obsolete. The consequences moved fast, and they moved in directions nobody in that amphitheater could have fully predicted. Within a year, ether anesthesia had been used in operations across Europe and the United States, and by 1847, the Scottish physician James Young Simpson had already introduced an alternative, chloroform, which he found easier to administer and which spread just as quickly through European hospitals. Surgeons who had spent entire careers optimizing for speed suddenly had the freedom to slow down, to work with the kind of care and precision that had simply been impossible when every extra second meant another second of a patient's screaming. Operations that had once been unthinkable because no patient could survive being conscious through them, deep abdominal surgery, complex orthopedic reconstruction, prolonged procedures on the chest and skull, gradually became possible for the first time in medical history. Administering the ether or chloroform itself also became a task too important to leave to whichever assistant happened to be free that day. Within a few decades, hospitals in Britain and the United States began appointing physicians whose entire job was managing a patient's unconsciousness throughout an operation, a role that eventually grew into the medical specialty now known as anesthesiology, complete with its own training, its own professional societies, and, by the early 20th century, its own dedicated academic chairs at major hospitals. Two of Robert Liston's own former students would go on to reshape surgery even further in ether's wake. James Simpson, who had watched Liston's ether demonstration as a young man, became chloroform's leading champion and later helped popularize its use in childbirth, most famously when it was administered to Queen Victoria herself in 1853 during the birth of her son Prince Leopold, a moment that did more to normalize obstetric anesthesia across Britain than any medical paper could have. The other student, Joseph Lister, took the newfound ability to operate slowly and carefully and combined it with an entirely separate insight that invisible germs, not bad air, caused the infections that had been killing roughly half of all surgical patients for centuries. Antiseptic surgery and anesthesia arrived within a generation of each other, and together they did what neither could have done alone. They turned the operating table from a place of near certain suffering into a place where recovery became the expectation rather than the exception. Not everyone connected to that first triumphant year in Boston got a happy ending. Horace Wells, still haunted by his public humiliation over nitrous oxide, became convinced that credit for the discovery of anesthesia rightfully belonged to him rather than to his former associate Morton, and spent his final years consumed by that dispute. He began self-experimenting with chloroform, developed a severe dependency on it, and in January 1848, while under the drug's influence, he was arrested in New York after a disturbing public incident. 3 days later, alone in his cell, ashamed and by his own account no longer able to trust his own mind, he took his own life. He was 33 years old. It is a genuinely sad footnote to a genuine medical breakthrough, and it is worth pausing on for a moment, because Wells's name, alongside Morton's and that of the chemist Charles Jackson, who also claimed credit, would spend the rest of the century locked in one of the bitterest priority disputes in the history of American medicine. A fight over recognition that outlasted, and arguably outweighed, the actual human cost each man had personally paid to get there. Morton himself, having poured his entire fortune into patenting and defending his claim to the discovery, died bankrupt in 1868, at just 48 years old. From Boston and London, the practice of surgical anesthesia spread outward with startling speed for an era without telephones, radio, or air travel. Ether reached Paris within months and was demonstrated in French hospitals by early 1847. It reached India, then under British colonial administration, by the same year, adapted for use in military field hospitals and mission clinics. Japan, whose own surgeon Seishu Haneoka had actually developed a general anesthetic formula called Mafutsusan back in 1804, more than 4 decades before Morton's demonstration, using a mixture of herbal alkaloids to perform Japan's first mastectomy under anesthesia, remained largely unaware of that fact in the West for over a century, since Hanaoka's work had never been translated or widely shared beyond Japan. Chloroform, meanwhile, made its way through continental Europe and into Russian and Ottoman medical practice by the 1850s, carried by traveling physicians and translated surgical journals. In Latin America, ether reached hospitals in Brazil, Mexico, and Peru within the same decade, often introduced by doctors who had trained in Paris or London and returned home eager to demonstrate it themselves. Within roughly 10 years of that single afternoon in the ether dome, a technique first tested on a nervous dentist's own dental patients had become standard practice on every inhabited continent. By the early 20th century, anesthesia had transformed from a novelty, performed by dentists and enthusiastic amateurs, into its own recognized medical specialty, with dedicated training, professional societies, and increasingly sophisticated equipment for controlling dosage and monitoring a patient's breathing and heart rate throughout an operation. What began as ether dripped from a soaked sponge evolved, over the following century, into intravenous drugs, precisely calibrated gas mixtures, and continuous electronic monitoring that would have seemed like pure fantasy to Morton or Liston. Today, anesthesia in some form makes possible more than 230 million major surgical procedures every single year across the world, according to estimates published in The Lancet, a figure that now exceeds the annual number of childbirths worldwide. The risk of dying specifically from the anesthesia itself, once measured at roughly 1 death for every 1,000 procedures back in the 1940s, has fallen, according to United States government health researchers, to somewhere between 1 in 200,000 and 1 in 300,000 procedures in wealthier countries today, an improvement of well over 200-fold in less than a century. And yet the story is far from evenly finished. The Lancet Commission on Global Surgery has estimated that roughly 5 billion people around the world still lack reliable access to safe, affordable surgical and anesthesia care when they need it. A stark reminder that the miracle demonstrated in that Boston amphitheater in 1846 still has not reached everyone it was meant to save. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people most, the one that elevates this story past a simple tale of 19th century triumph. Even now, with all of modern neuroscience at its disposal, medicine still does not fully understand how anesthesia actually works. Researchers know which receptors drugs like propofol bind to in the brain, and they can measure, in real time, the exact moment a patient's brainwaves shift as consciousness switches off. But the deeper question, how disrupting those receptors causes the specific total disappearance of subjective awareness itself, remains, in the words of neuroscientists who study it, one of the genuine open mysteries of modern brain science. Every single day, in operating rooms on every continent, doctors reliably switch off human consciousness and switch it back on again, using a tool whose fundamental mechanism nobody alive can fully explain. Fanny Burney lived another 29 years after her operation in that Paris bedroom, long enough to publish another novel and write the letter that would preserve, in her own unforgettable words, exactly what surgery used to cost a human being. Robert Liston died the year after performing his own triumphant ether operation, a man who had built his entire legend on outrunning pain, just in time to watch pain itself be defeated by something other than speed. And in a quiet operating theater in Boston, a nervous dentist and a skeptical surgeon spent a few unbearably tense minutes proving to a room full of people who expected to watch someone fail again that human beings did not have to suffer to be healed. The scream that once defined every operation in history simply stopped. It has never fully come back. If this story stuck with you, subscribe. Tell us in the comments which moment horrified you most, and like the video before you go.